Well, for those of you who are tired of the debate over the Second Amendment, Mark Cuban, the famous billionaire owner of the Dallas Mavericks and star of Shark Tank on CNBC, has a solution. Hi, I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, and this right angle is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. And gentlemen, this is a novel idea, and he takes two concepts that you're both going to love and ties them together in a way that I think you'll find very special. Basically, he wants to edit the Second Amendment to say two things.
I love it already.
Number one is that the federal government will never be allowed to confiscate that gun from you because you have an absolute right under federal law to own that gun. And number two, we're going to respect the rights of the states to pass their own laws in this federated republic. And so we're going to let individual states make any kind of regulations about guns that they'd like to. And then people can vote for their feet about which state they want to live in. If you live in Texas, says Cuban, maybe open carry is all the rage, and so let's keep doing that. But if you live in Pennsylvania, where they're a little more stringent, maybe they don't allow you to have a gun on your premises unless it's under lock and key, or perhaps even more restrictive than that. Bill Whittle, I know that you're a shill for the NRA, or at least used to be. And so let me ask you this. You know very well that the Second Amendment is nothing but a fundraising tool for the NRA, and that nobody really wants to find a solution for this problem. But are you willing to stop for a moment and say, hey, wait a minute, we get states' rights and a federal restriction, or a restriction on the federal government from touching my gun rights? What could go wrong with that, Bill?
Technically speaking, it's the assault on the Second Amendment that's the shill for the NRA fundraising. I just thought I'd clarify that. If people just left the Second Amendment alone, we wouldn't be having that problem, and my former employers would not be raking in the money that they're raking in now. Okay, so basically what he says is every American has a right to own a gun. That's in my Second Amendment right already. And he says the government cannot take away those guns. That's also in my Second Amendment right. So now he's saying, but we should be able to regulate gun ownership based on the states that you live in, which is also the case, basically. I mean, certainly the gun laws in California are different than the gun laws in Texas. But this is not a states' rights issue. The Constitution is the technical manual for the government of the United States, and at a federal level, and the Bill of Rights is the moral justification for that power. So he doesn't have look, the nice thing about having principles is you can always go to your principles. We like the idea of pushing power away from the federal government, but that doesn't mean all power has to be pushed away from the federal government. Otherwise, we wouldn't need a federal government. Now, you could go about that case if you want to, but clearly the Constitution structures the federal government, and the Constitution has included in it protections to protect the government from taking away my natural law rights of being able to defend myself. So if Mark Cuban is in favor of a constitutional amendment that adds this clause, which kind of already exists, you're going to have to forgive me for thinking that it's a backdoor way of sneaking some kind of something in somewhere, where I think, needless to say, if I could drag some of the founders forward to the present day and explain to them the confusion that a well-regulated militia has among people who can't comprehend English quite as well as others, I would have left that out. But the point is, this thing is absolutely useless because everything that it talks about is already here, unless the actual wording of it would put in a loophole to add additional confiscatory powers. And if it's coming from Mark Cuban, I'm assuming that's what it is, because if you believe in gun rights, you've already got that protection.
Stephen Green, what Cuban has done with this is basically say that, while and every Democrat who gets out on the stump also says we don't want to take away your guns and Americans have a right to have guns and stuff like that. But what he's basically done is taken all the disputable matters around that gun ownership and put those back into the hands of the states and basically punted to them and said, okay, you take care of that. And Steve, this seems like a very kind of free market solution, doesn't it? Because if you want to live in a state that has open carry like Texas, then you move to Texas. And
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. It's such an important point, and I just plain forgot it, Scotty. I'm so sorry. I was talking about the federal government, the structure of the federal government. I'm in favor of things like taking the Department of Education away because it doesn't belong there. There's no constitutional basis for it, and pushing that down to the states. So it's not like I don't think that this is a good idea of taking things from the federal government and pushing it down to the states. I just think that the things are specifically in the Constitution need to stay there on a federal level. So sorry about that.
And Steve's the point, and that was Bill clarifying that made it even easier to ask this question, because basically the argument is over whether that stuff really is in the Constitution or the Second Amendment. The people on the left say it isn't. People on the right say it is. Steve, why not let the states be the adjudicators of these questions and let people vote with their feet about where they want to live?
Yeah, it's really clever what Cuban has done here, because what he's done is taken two issues that are conservative issues, support for the Second Amendment and support for federalism, and kind of conflated them together to make a liberal point, I should say a left-wing point, about gun control, that the state somebody should be able to take our damn guns away, right? And let me go off on just a little bit of a rant here.
Well, no, he doesn't say anybody can take your guns away, Steve, because he's saying every American has the right.
Can't do it.
No. Yeah, but he says every American has the right to own a gun. What we're talking about is, I want to be clear on what he's saying, just so we don't misinterpret what he's saying. He said states have the right to manage that gun ownership, the purchase, the ownership, the management.
Yeah. Great. Again, he's taken two conservative issues and conflated them together to push a progressive point that we need more gun control. He's just willing to sort of give up on the issue in places like Texas, so that he can get more of it in places like California and New York. Let's be honest about what he's doing here. That said, I have to go off on a little bit of a rant here. I really hate the phrase states' rights. Governments don't have rights. Governments have power. I don't care whether it's your local government, your state government, or the federal government. Governments have powers. Individuals have rights. And governments only have the powers granted to them by the people who are sovereign. End of story. And what the Bill of Rights states is that there are certain rights that the people, not even the people, can abrogate to the government. There are some powers that we do not have the authority to give to the government, because these are our inalienable rights, and the government does not have the power to take those from us, even if in some sort of fit of madness we decide to surrender them. That's what the Bill of Rights is really about, and I think we need to be very explicit about that meaning. That said, let's look at a different amendment, the 13th Amendment. That's the one that abolished slavery. But that amendment was passed without even all the states in the Union really getting a say. They didn't get to vote on it. And in fact, states like Texas and Florida and Alabama were brought back into the Union against their will, their very violent will, after the 13th Amendment had been passed. So you might make the argument that the 13th Amendment is even less legitimate than the Second Amendment, because all the states of the Union got to decide on the Bill of Rights, and states that were brought into the Union on their own accord, like Colorado or California, knew that the Second Amendment was a part of the package. So maybe the states need broad latitude in interpreting the 13th Amendment. Is this going to play very well, do you think? No, and it's really no different, I don't think.
Well, I think there are two interesting aspects about this proposal by Mark Cuban. And by the way, I invite creative proposals like this. I think it's useful to have people in this country discussing these fundamental issues and the Constitution itself, and natural rights versus rights that are conferred by government, which only one side would acknowledge the latter. But I think there are a couple of things here. First of all, in the most recent session of the Texas State Legislature, they passed a law expanding local school districts' ability to use firearms to protect their students. I think, if I understand correctly, it used to be just kind of you could have a guy on campus who was doing that, and now they're giving much more latitude to local school districts to be able to protect their students by having firearms in the hands of responsible adults in the school building. And so Texas is clearly tacking in one direction. The other thing is, you think through this proposal by Mark Cuban and what is the net effect if it follows true to form with the political division in this country, where the Democrats tend to control the population clusters in urban areas and Republicans tend to control the wide open spaces, so to speak. And this, Democrats would agree with me on this, because they would say, why should all those states get a vote? Shouldn't it be the people that make the decision? What you'll have is ultimately much stricter gun control in metropolitan areas. You'll have much stricter gun control, frankly, in areas where there are higher concentrations of minorities, blacks and Latinos and other kinds of minorities. In effect, what you have is progressive Democrats finding a way to control access to firearms by people that are different than they are, by people whose color is different, by people whose national origin story is different. And that's what concerns me most about this, because basically what you're talking about when you follow this Mark Cuban's logic out to its extreme is you're creating enclaves of helplessness for people who most need to be able to defend themselves. And I'm not saying that the Constitution could not be amended to do this thing. I'm just saying that in that consideration, the people who will be left helpless in the process should be the ones who have the greatest say in this process. And if I were an African American living in the inner city, I'd be very concerned about a Democratic Party that was talking about finding ways to make it much more difficult for me to defend my wife and children. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making Right Angle possible.